In this lesson, we're talking about methods of disease transmission. We are speaking specifically about this dot point as well, talking about analysing data. So be mindful of that. All right, there are substantial numbers of infectious diseases in the world. We should be aware of that. Some of them are contagious, so we're talking person to person, organism to organism. Others are not. Pathogens are disease-causing agents, all right? And these can be cellular or non-cellular. We're talking cellular like bacteria, fungal, protozoa, parasites, but they're also things like viruses that are considered not living, right? Non-living, and therefore we talk about them as molecules, right? And that's going to be covered in later lessons. So once a pathogen has been transmitted, there are many ways or many possibilities with regard to how quickly we can show signs and symptoms and be infectious. So if you're talking about exposure to the pathogen just here, you might only become infectious a bit later on. You might be asymptomatic for a large portion of that time and then the end of infectious period. But you might be showing symptoms throughout that whole time that I'm talking about. All right, lots of different modes of infectious disease transmission, and I will be talking about all of these today. Okay, direct contact requires actual physical contact between the infected person and a susceptible person, or it might even be on a surface. So the physical transmission of this organism. It includes touching, kissing, sexual contact, contact with any oral secretions, so that's that kissing thing, contact with any open body lesions or wounds or things like that. And things that are transferred directly may be able to survive for long periods of time on surfaces, but generally not. They need a host. So gross things like these, right? Now we're elbow bumping, it's probably a bit safer. In terms of indirect contact, we're talking now a little bit about picking things up off other surfaces. So situations where a susceptible person is infected from contact with a contaminated surface. So frequent touch surfaces like phones, door handles, handrails, bathroom and kitchen surfaces, keyboards, mice, eating utensils, writing equipment, stationery. Some organisms are capable of surviving on these surfaces for a really long period of time, and there's lots of discussion at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic talking about that COVID-19 can last up to 72 hours on certain surfaces but not other surfaces. So I wonder if that's been fact-checked since. Droplet contact occurs when infected droplets make contact with the eyes, the nose, the mouth, any opening on the body essentially. And it's generally generated when an infected person coughs, sneezes, talks, or those kinds of things. Droplets settle really quickly as they are quite large. Examples of diseases that spread this way are measles and COVID. However, there is certain talk lately that COVID can also be passed via airborne transmission. Now, it's similar to the droplet transmission, except these are tiny particles that actually stay in the air for a lot longer. So that's why they're a little bit more dangerous. And these occur when particles containing those microorganisms are suspended in the air. And they can survive for huge amounts of time because they are resistant to drying. So organisms can then enter the respiratory tract just via air. So we're talking things like chickenpox, which is really, really unfortunate. Okay, fecal oral transmission is associated with organisms that infect the digestive system. So things that are going in your mouth, like food and water, can lead to these. Microorganisms enter the body through contaminated water or food, and they can multiply in the intestines. And these are generally in areas where sewage enters the water supply and things mix up when they shouldn't be. And these are known as downstream effects. So these things are called life straws, and they actually filter water as you are drinking them in, and they're becoming quite common as charity and aid organisations send them to developing nations, but also you're talking about water sources and where we're getting them from. Vector-borne transmission. So we're talking animals. Different animals are capable of transmitting these diseases, and we're talking about things like malaria, very, very common. We're talking vectors like fleas, mites, ticks, rats, dogs, flies, and the bubonic plague was spread through fleas on rats. So it wasn't the rats, it was actually the fleas on the rats. And just to add an extra dimension, these can travel really long distances. They can spread a long way. They're not just spread through biting, they can also be through touching of fecal matter of another vector like a dog. So Let's look at some data that actually exhibits these kinds of transmission patterns. So we're talking, number one, about direct contact via droplets. So you can see these start to blur the lines of which one it is. And we're talking pertussis, which is also known as whooping cough. It is caused by a bacterium called Bordetella pertussis. It's highly infectious, and you might see if someone in your family has a baby, they might insist that you get the whooping cough vaccine before you see them, because huge numbers of cases are happening in really early years. So they're not going to get that vaccine until later on down the track, so making sure you are vaccinated in case you potentially hand it on to them. Behaviors, movements, and transmission of droplet-mediated respiratory diseases during airline flights. Now, if you want to hold your breath on every flight you take, you might not want to look at this. So, over 3 billion airline passengers annually, the in-flight transmission of infectious diseases is really important. We know that now more than ever. But over a dozen cases of in-flight transmission of serious infections have been documented. But despite all of this, we actually don't know what the risks are. We don't do enough studies on them. And these images are actually talking about, where you sit in the flight if someone's infected and who is going to get infected near them, even though all that air is being recycled. All right, unsafe water kills more people than disasters and conflicts. And these are kind of stats that we get from the World Health Organization and UNICEF and all those kinds of charities that also help in developing nations. If we're talking, the share of people without access to basic drinking water services in 2015, huge numbers of countries do not have the ability to just go to the tap, turn it on, and get safe drinking water. So if we're looking at where those hotspots might be, we're definitely looking at developed nations. Common sources of foodborne illnesses. We're talking biological contamination when bacteria and toxins contaminate the food. And we talk about that in terms of food poisoning. So we're talking things like salmonella, staphylococcus, listeria. They're really common. They're extremely toxic to our system. And so they multiply in us and they produce waste in us. And our body tries to expel them as quickly as we can. Now, interestingly, climatic conditions can change a lot to favour certain vectors. So if we're talking about a vector-borne disease, we're talking about something like malaria, which comes in a number of different forms and a number of different vectors, all mosquitoes. We can talk about, say, if climate change is increasing that tropical zone in the middle around the equator, then we're going to have more conditions that favour those vectors, those mosquitoes, and they're going to breed and we're going to spread pathogens potentially more. So you can see here, they are increasing in numbers, and that's only in sort of a 2 to 3 year period. Data must try to track prevention strategies as well. Interestingly, if we're talking about malaria, this is the proportion of individuals using LLINs, which is a long-lasting insecticidal net. So we're talking about a net over your bed to stop the actual vector getting in. And when those strategies start to decrease, you might actually start to see cases increase. But, there are other factors to take on board as well, like rainfall. So we would expect the number of malaria episodes to go down. However, the number of rainy days or the amount of millimeters of rain falling there has actually increased, which could potentially lead to more mosquitoes. So, I'm no expert, but this might actually be a good result, even though the numbers of malaria cases are still quite big. So lots to go on there, and we will still come back to some of these points. They'll be in other lessons. So please make sure you have a read through your Pearson text as well, please.